The storm didn't arrive quietly. It tore across the valley like something alive, something angry. Wind slammed against the ranch fences, snow whipped sideways through the air, and the horses, they knew. Long before the first thunder cracked, the herd had started pacing, restless, uneasy, their instinct screaming what no human could yet see. And in the far corner of the ranch, beyond the broken fence line no one bothered to fix, one horse stood alone, bleeding, trembling, and waiting. Ethan Cole saw it when no one else did. He wasn't supposed to be out there. Not during a storm warning. Not after the boss had made it crystal clear, you keep your head down, do your job, and don't get sentimental about the animals. But Ethan had never been good at ignoring things that felt wrong, and that horse felt wrong. Lightning flashed, and for a split second, the world lit up like daylight. That's when he saw the blood. The horse, a dark bay with a torn flank and wild, terrified eyes, was caught in twisted wire near the old boundary fence. Each time it struggled, the wire dug deeper into its skin. It wasn't just stuck. It was dying. Ethan's breath caught. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. Behind him, the ranch buildings were barely visible through the storm. No one would notice if he turned back. No one would blame him. The ranch had strict rules. Injured wild horses weren't worth the risk. They weren't assets. They were liabilities. But Ethan didn't move. Because the horse didn't stop looking at him. There was something in its gaze, not just fear, but defiance. Like it refused to die here, tangled and alone. Like it was daring him to make a choice. And that was all it took. If you've ever had a moment where your gut told you something louder than logic ever could, you already know what happened next. Ethan stepped forward. The wind roared louder, as if trying to push him back. Snow stung his face, his boots sank into freezing mud, but he kept going. Step by step, closer to the struggling animal. "Easy, easy," he said, though his voice was barely audible over the storm. The horse thrashed violently as he approached, panic surging through its body. Its hooves struck the ground hard, slipping dangerously close to Ethan's legs. One wrong move, and this could end badly. But Ethan didn't stop. He raised his hand slowly, showing he wasn't a threat. Years of working with horses had taught him one thing above all else: fear spreads fast, but calm can spread faster, if you're patient enough. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he whispered. For a brief second, just one, the horse paused. Its ears flicked forward. Its breathing slowed just enough. That was the opening. Ethan moved in quickly, grabbing the twisted wire and trying to pull it loose. The metal bit into his gloves, slicing through the leather as he worked. The horse jerked again, nearly knocking him off balance. "Hold on," he shouted. Another flash of lightning. Another crack of thunder. Time was running out. The storm was getting worse. The temperature was dropping fast. If they didn't get free soon, neither of them was walking out of there. Ethan reached for the small knife on his belt. His fingers were numb, shaking, but he forced them steady. Carefully, he started cutting through the wire, one strand at a time. The horse screamed, a raw, desperate sound that echoed through the storm. And then, something changed. Instead of fighting him, the horse went still. Not completely. Not peacefully. But enough. Enough to trust him. That single moment, fragile, impossible, was the turning point. Ethan cut faster. One strand snapped. Then another. The tension in the wire loosened, and suddenly the horse stumbled free, collapsing onto the snow-covered ground. Blood stained the white surface beneath it. Ethan dropped to his knees beside it. Hey, stay with me," he said, his voice softer now. The horse's chest rose and fell rapidly. Its eyes, once wild with fear, now flickered with something else. Recognition. Trust. And maybe gratitude. But this wasn't over. Not even close. Because saving the horse was the easy part. Getting it back alive. That was where everything would fall apart. Ethan looked toward the ranch again. The storm had swallowed everything. No help was coming. And even if it did, he knew what they'd say. Leave it. It's not worth it. It's just a horse. But standing there, with blood on his hands and a life depending on him, Ethan made a decision that would cost him everything. "I'm not leaving you," he said firmly. He shrugged off his coat and draped it over the horse's body, trying to keep it warm. Then, with all the strength he had left, he began the impossible task of lifting the animal, inch by inch, step by step. If you're feeling the weight of this moment already, you're not alone. Because what Ethan didn't know yet was that this single choice would set off a chain of events no one on that ranch, or in that entire valley, would ever forget. By the time Ethan dragged the injured horse into the outer stable, the storm had already swallowed the night whole. Snow piled against the wooden doors, the wind howled through every crack, and his body felt like it was made of stone and fire at the same time, frozen on the outside, burning with exhaustion underneath. The horse collapsed the moment they reached shelter, its legs folding beneath it as if they had carried more than just its weight, as if they had carried its will to survive. Ethan dropped beside it, chest heaving, hands shaking, his gloves soaked through with a mix of melting snow and blood. For a moment, neither of them moved. Just the sound of wind screaming outside and two living beings clinging to breath inside. Then Ethan forced himself up. There was no time to rest. Not yet. Maybe not ever again, not after what he'd just done. He grabbed old blankets, a rusted bucket, anything he could find, working fast but careful, cleaning the wound as best as he could. The gash along the horse's flank was deep, too deep for comfort, and every time Ethan pressed the cloth against it, the horse flinched, its muscles tightening with pain. But it didn't lash out. It didn't fight him. It watched him. And that was the part Ethan couldn't shake, the way those eyes followed him, not with fear anymore, but with something dangerously close to belief. "You picked the wrong night to test me," he muttered, trying to keep his voice steady, though a part of him already knew this wasn't about testing him. This was about changing him. Outside, the storm raged harder, rattling the stable doors like something trying to break in, but inside, a different kind of tension was building. The kind that comes when you know you've crossed the line you can't uncross. And right on cue, the stable door slammed open. "What the hell is this?" The voice cut through the air like a blade. Ethan didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Marcus Hale, the ranch owner, a man whose rules weren't just guidelines, they were law. Ethan exhaled slowly before looking back. "It was caught in the fence," he said, keeping his tone even. "It would have died out there." Marcus stepped closer, his boots echoing against the wooden floor, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the horse. For a second, just 1 second, there was hesitation in his expression, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "And," he said coldly, "that's not our problem." There it was. The line Ethan knew he'd crossed. He stood up, placing himself slightly between Marcus and the horse without even realizing it. "It is now," he replied. Silence. Heavy. Dangerous. The kind that doesn't need shouting to make its point. Marcus looked at him, really looked at him this time. Not as a worker, not as part of the ranch, but as a problem. "You broke protocol," Marcus said finally. "You risked yourself, for a wild horse. One we don't own. One that brings us nothing." Ethan clenched his jaw. "It's alive." Marcus scoffed, shaking his head. "Not for long, if that wound gets infected. And even if it survives, it's useless to us. You think this is a rescue center?" The words hit harder than the storm outside. Not because they were loud, but because they were expected. And somehow, that made them worse. Ethan glanced back at the horse. Its breathing had slowed slightly, but it was still weak, still hanging on by something fragile and unseen. "It trusted me," Ethan said quietly. Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's your mistake right there. You don't earn a living by trusting animals. You earn it by knowing when to walk away." And just like that, the moment snapped. "Then maybe I'm in the wrong place," Ethan shot back, before he could stop himself. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything that had come before. Marcus's expression hardened instantly. "Maybe you are." Another silence. This one final. The kind that closes doors, literally and figuratively. Marcus reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded paper, and tossed it onto a nearby table. "You're done here," he said flatly. "Pack your things in the morning. If you're still here by noon, I'll have you escorted out." Ethan stared at the paper, his chest tightening. Fired. Just like that. No warning. No second chance. Just, over. All because he refused to let something die. Behind him, the horse shifted slightly, letting out a weak breath, as if reminding him what this was all for. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, then nodded. Fine. Marcus turned without another word, stepping back into the storm, the door slamming shut behind him. And just like that, it was quiet again. But not the same kind of quiet as before. This one carried consequences. Ethan stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, then at the paper, then finally back at the horse. Guess it's just us now, he said, his voice softer than before. He walked back over, kneeling beside it once more. The horse's eyes met his again, tired, but still there. Still fighting. Still, trusting. And that was when something shifted inside Ethan. Not regret. Not fear. Something stronger. Resolve. Because losing his job. That was one thing. But losing himself, that was something he refused to do. You're gonna make it, he said firmly, placing a steady hand against the horse's neck. I didn't come this far just to watch you quit. Outside, the storm began to settle, the wind easing just enough to let the silence creep back in. But far beyond the ranch, beyond the trees and hills and frozen ground, something else was happening. Something no one there could see yet. Because out in the wild, where the untouched horses roamed free, the herd had noticed. And they hadn't forgotten. If you think this story is about to slow down here, it's not. Because what's coming next isn't just about survival anymore. It's about something far bigger. And trust me, you won't see it coming. Morning didn't come gently, it crept in through a grey sky, cold and unforgiving, as if the storm had simply stepped aside to let reality take its place. Ethan hadn't slept. Not even for a minute. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the wire cutting into flesh, heard the horse's desperate cry echoing through the wind. So he stayed awake, sitting in the dim light of the stable, one hand resting lightly on the horse's neck, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of its breathing. It was still alive. And somehow, stronger. The bleeding had slowed. The trembling had eased. But the real surprise came when the horse tried to stand. At first, it was just a shift, a tightening of muscles, a subtle lift of its head. Then, slowly, painfully, it pushed itself up, legs shaking beneath its weight. Ethan moved back slightly, giving it space, his heart pounding harder with every second. Easy, don't rush it, he murmured. The horse wobbled, nearly collapsing again, but it didn't. It held itself up. Barely, but enough. And then it turned its head toward him. That same look again. Not fear. Not confusion. Recognition. Ethan exhaled slowly, almost afraid to move, as if any sudden motion might break whatever fragile connection had formed between them. Yeah, you're tougher than you look, he said quietly. The moment didn't last long. Reality had a way of crashing back in, and this time, it came in the form of footsteps outside the stable. Voices. Low, murmuring, but growing louder. Ethan stood up, his jaw tightening. He didn't need to hear what they were saying. News traveled fast on a ranch, especially when someone broke the rules. The stable door creaked open, and two of the ranch hands stepped in, their expressions somewhere between curiosity and discomfort. You're still here? One of them asked, glancing at Ethan, then at the horse. Yeah, Ethan replied simply. They exchanged looks. One of them shook his head. Marcus isn't gonna like that. Ethan let out a short breath. Marcus already made that clear. Silence settled between them for a moment, thick with everything that didn't need to be said. Finally, the other man spoke, lowering his voice slightly. Look, you should just leave. Take whatever you've got and go. Don't make this worse. Ethan glanced back at the horse. It was still standing, barely, but standing nonetheless. Every instinct in him screamed that leaving now would undo everything. I'm not leaving it, he said. The first ranch hand frowned. It's not yours. No, Ethan agreed. But I'm the reason it's still alive. That ended the conversation. They didn't argue. Didn't try to convince him again. They just looked at him for a long moment, then turned and walked out, the door shutting behind them with a quiet finality. Ethan stood there, alone again. Or at least, he thought he was. Because just a few seconds later, something else broke the silence. A sound. Faint at first. Distant. But unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Ethan froze. At first, he told himself it was nothing. Just the ranch horses being moved, maybe reacting to the storm's aftermath. But this was different. This was coordinated, rhythmic, and growing louder. The horse beside him heard it too. Its ears shot forward, its entire body tensing, not in fear, but in alertness. Awareness. Recognition. Ethan turned slowly toward the stable door, his pulse quickening. "What is that?" he whispered. The hoofbeats grew stronger, echoing across the frozen ground outside, rolling like distant thunder. Not one or two horses. Many. Too many. Ethan stepped toward the door, his hand hovering over the handle. For a brief second, doubt flickered in his mind. And then he pulled it open. The cold air hit him instantly, sharp and biting, but he barely felt it. Because what he saw didn't make sense. At the edge of the ranch, just beyond the broken fence line where the storm had done its worst, a line of horses stood. Wild horses. Dozens of them. Maybe more. Their coats varied, bays, chestnuts, greys, but they all shared one thing: stillness. Absolute, deliberate stillness. They weren't grazing. They weren't wandering. They were watching. Watching the stable. Watching him. Ethan stepped forward slowly, his breath catching in his throat. "No way," he muttered under his breath. Behind him, the injured horse shifted again, letting out a low, almost soft sound. A call. And in response, the herd moved. Not chaotically. Not wildly. Together. They stepped forward as one, closing the distance between themselves and the ranch, their hooves crunching against the thin layer of snow. It wasn't a charge. It wasn't aggression. It was something else. Something intentional. Something that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "They came for you," he whispered, glancing back at the horse. The idea sounded insane even as he said it. And yet, there they were. The wild herd. Standing at the edge of a place they would normally avoid at all costs. Because of one horse. Because of what had happened last night. The injured horse took another step forward, moving closer to the open door, its body still weak but driven by something stronger than pain. Ethan instinctively reached out, steadying it. "You shouldn't be moving," he said softly. But the horse didn't stop. It stepped out into the open air, into the cold, its eyes locked on the approaching herd. And for a moment, just one fleeting, unbelievable moment, everything felt connected. Like Ethan was witnessing something he wasn't meant to see. Something ancient. Something powerful. The bond between them wasn't just between a man and a horse anymore. It was bigger than that. And then, "Ethan!" The shout shattered the moment. Ethan turned sharply to see Marcus striding across the yard, his expression darker than the storm from the night before. Behind him, more ranch hands followed, their movements tense, uncertain. Marcus stopped a few feet away, his gaze shifting from Ethan to the injured horse and then to the herd beyond the fence. For the first time, something cracked in his composure. "What is that?" he demanded. Ethan didn't answer right away. Because the truth. And in that moment, standing there with the cold air cutting through him and the sound of hooves filling his ears, Ethan realized something that sent a wave of awe and fear through his entire body. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because the horse he saved. It hadn't just survived. It had returned something. And whatever was coming next was going to change everything. What happened next didn't explode into chaos the way anyone expected. It unfolded slowly, almost deliberately, like something guided by a force no one there could control or fully understand. The herd didn't charge. They didn't scatter. They advanced with calm, measured steps, their hooves pressing into the thin snow as if they had all the time in the world, as if this moment had been building long before the storm, long before Ethan ever stepped toward that broken fence. Every ranch hand stood frozen, uncertainty written across their faces, the kind that comes when instincts clash with reality. These were wild horses, unpredictable, powerful, dangerous when provoked. And yet, There was no aggression here. Only presence. Only intention. Ethan could feel it in the air, thick and electric, like the silence before a revelation. Beside him, the injured horse stepped forward again, no longer trembling the way it had in the stable, no longer clinging to survival but standing in it, owning it. Its wound was still there, raw and real, but somehow it no longer defined the moment. What defined it was the way the herd responded. One by one, they slowed, then stopped, forming a wide arc just beyond the broken fence, their eyes locked not on the ranch, not on the people, but on that single horse. A ripple passed through them, subtle but unmistakable, like recognition spreading from one to another. And then something even stranger happened, something that no rulebook, no ranch training, no hardened logic could explain. The lead horse, a massive grey stallion with scars that told stories no human had heard, stepped forward alone. The rest of the herd stayed back, watching, waiting. Marcus shifted beside Ethan, his voice lower now, stripped of its usual authority. "That's not normal," he muttered, almost to himself. But Ethan barely heard him. Because the injured horse had begun to walk. Slow. Steady. Deliberate. Each step looked like it should hurt, and maybe it did, but it didn't stop. It crossed the invisible line between ranch and wild, between control and freedom, until it stood just a few feet from the grey stallion. Time seemed to stretch thin. No one moved. No one spoke. And then, in a gesture so quiet yet so powerful it stole the breath from everyone watching, the stallion lowered its head. Not in submission. Not in weakness. In acknowledgement. The injured horse responded the same way, their foreheads nearly touching for a brief, sacred second. It wasn't dominance. It wasn't challenge. It was something deeper, connection, recognition, gratitude, in a language beyond words. A wave of emotion hit Ethan so suddenly he didn't even try to fight it. Because in that moment, he understood. This wasn't just a herd. This was a family. And last night, without realizing it, he had stepped into their story. Behind him, one of the ranch hands whispered, "Are they thanking him?" No one answered. Because no one could deny what it felt like. The air shifted again, but this time it wasn't tense, it was something else. Awe. The kind that silences doubt. The kind that makes even the most stubborn man question what he thought he knew. Marcus took a step forward, his eyes narrowing, but not with anger, something closer to disbelief. "This doesn't change anything," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We can't have wild horses gathering like this. It's a risk." Ethan turned to him slowly, his expression steady, grounded in something far stronger than defiance now. "They're not a risk," he said. "They're responding." Marcus scoffed, but it came out weaker than before. "To what?" "One horse." Ethan shook his head slightly. "To being seen." The words hung in the cold air, heavier than any argument. Because deep down, everyone there knew it was true. The herd hadn't come for territory. They hadn't come for food. They had come because one of their own had been saved, and they hadn't ignored it. The grey stallion lifted its head, its gaze shifting, just for a second, toward Ethan. And in that look, there was no fear. No hostility. Only awareness. It saw him. Not as a threat. Not as a stranger. But as something else entirely. Something earned. The moment passed, but its impact didn't. The stallion turned slightly, letting out a low, resonant call. The herd responded instantly, stepping forward just enough to tighten their formation before slowly, almost ceremoniously, beginning to turn away. Not running. Not fleeing. Leaving. But not empty-handed. As the herd moved, a smaller group broke away. 3, maybe 4 horses, lingering closer to the ranch boundary, their presence quieter but intentional. It wasn't random. It was a choice. And somehow, everyone felt it. They weren't just leaving. They were giving something back. Marcus exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face as if trying to wipe away what he'd just seen. This is insane," he muttered. But no one laughed. Because for the first time, the ranch didn't feel like a place of control. It felt like a place that had just been witnessed and judged. Ethan looked back at the injured horse, now standing stronger, steadier, its place between two worlds more obvious than ever. "You're not just any horse, are you?" he said quietly. The horse didn't answer, but it didn't need to. Because what happened next would say everything. And if you've made it this far, you already feel it, that shift, that pull, that sense that something bigger is unfolding. And trust me, the final part of this story? It's not just emotional. It's unforgettable. The silence that followed the herd's departure didn't feel empty. It felt full. Full of questions no one could answer, full of something unspoken that lingered in the cold air long after the last hoofbeat faded into the distance. The ranch, once defined by routine and control, now stood still, as if it had just witnessed something it wasn't built to understand. And at the center of it all stood Ethan, jobless, exhausted, and somehow more certain than ever that he had made the only choice he could have. For a long moment, no one moved. Marcus was the first to break, but even he didn't sound like the same man anymore. "Everyone back to work," he said, though the command lacked its usual sharp edge. The ranch hands hesitated, glancing between Ethan, the remaining horses near the boundary, and the path where the herd had vanished. Slowly, uncertainly, they dispersed, their minds clearly somewhere else. Because how do you go back to normal after something like that? Ethan didn't try. He stayed right where he was, his eyes drifting back to the injured horse. It hadn't followed the herd. It hadn't run back into the wild. Instead, it stood a few feet away from him, breathing steadily now, its strength returning with each passing second. The wound was still there, but it no longer looked like the end of its story. It looked like proof that it had survived one. "You could have gone," Ethan said quietly, stepping closer. The horse flicked an ear, watching him with that same deep, unwavering gaze. "But you didn't." Something about that realization hit harder than anything else that day. Because it meant this wasn't just about instinct. It wasn't just about survival. It was a choice. And somehow, the horse had chosen him. Behind him, Marcus's voice came again, closer this time. "You're still here." Ethan turned slowly. "Yeah." Marcus studied him, really studied him, as if seeing him for the first time, not as an employee, not as a problem, but as someone who had stood in the middle of something impossible and didn't back down. The tension between them was still there, but it had changed shape. "You cost me a worker," Marcus said. Ethan gave a small, tired nod. "I know." Marcus glanced toward the fence, where the last of the wild horses had disappeared beyond the hills. Then he looked back at the one standing beside Ethan. "And maybe, you saved me something I didn't realize I was losing." The words were quiet, almost reluctant, but they were real. Ethan didn't respond right away. Because sometimes, silence carries more meaning than anything you could say. Marcus exhaled, then gestured slightly toward the horse. "That one, it's not going to make it out there like this." Ethan looked back at the horse, then at the open land beyond. He already knew that. "I wasn't planning on sending it back," he said. Another pause. Then Marcus nodded once. "Then I guess you're not fired." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Marcus shrugged lightly, though there was a hint of something unfamiliar in his expression: respect. Ranch could use someone who knows when not to walk away. For a second, Ethan just stared at him, trying to process what he'd just heard. After everything, after the argument, the ultimatum, the certainty of losing everything, it had turned. Not because of a fight. Not because of a demand. But because of what had been witnessed. Because of what couldn't be denied. Ethan let out a slow breath, a weight lifting from his chest that he hadn't even realized was still there. "So, what now?" he asked. Marcus glanced toward the horizon again. "Now. We fix that fence. And maybe, we stop pretending we understand everything out here." It wasn't an apology. But it was close enough. Days passed, and the ranch slowly found its rhythm again, but it wasn't the same rhythm as before. Something had shifted. The horses were calmer. The air felt different. Even the ranch hands worked with a little more awareness, a little less certainty that they were in control of everything. And the injured horse. It healed. Not overnight. Not perfectly. But steadily. Stronger with each sunrise. It never fully left Ethan's side during those early days, following him through the ranch, watching, learning. And Ethan, in return, gave it something it had never known before: patience without expectation, trust without force. Weeks later, on a quiet morning when the sky stretched clear and endless above the valley, Ethan led the horse out to the edge of the repaired fence. The same place where it had once been trapped. The same place where everything had changed. "You're free to go," he said softly, resting a hand against its neck. The horse stood still. For a moment, Ethan wondered if it would hesitate, if it would stay. But then it stepped forward. One step. Then another. Crossing the boundary between ranch and wild once more. Ethan watched it go, a mix of pride and something deeper settling in his chest. Because letting go was part of the bond too. The horse reached the top of a small rise, then paused. And turned back. Just for a second. Long enough for their eyes to meet one last time. And then it was gone. Or at least, that's what Ethan thought. Because later that evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in gold, a distant sound rolled across the land. Hoofbeats. Familiar. Powerful. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his heart already knowing what his eyes hadn't yet confirmed. At the edge of the horizon, silhouettes began to form. Not one. Not a few. A herd. Returning. Not to stay. Not to be owned. But to pass through. And as they did, one by one, they slowed near the ranch, just enough to be seen. Just enough to be felt. A reminder. Of what happens when compassion wins over convenience. Of what changes when someone chooses not to walk away. Ethan stood there in silence, a small smile forming as the last light of day faded behind the moving shapes. And if this story meant something to you, if you felt even a fraction of what that moment carried, take a second to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes that even the smallest act of kindness can echo farther than we ever imagine. Because out there, somewhere beyond what we can explain, it already has.